Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss American pilgrimage. I want to emphasize the subtitle here, A Historical Journey Through Catholic Life in a New World. So this is not a history of America, although it does include that, and that's the framework, but it really is a story of the Catholic presence in the New World, both Spanish, French, and English. I wonder, I don't give our names every time we do this, but I want, Thomas, do we know when people click on this or try and get it, do they see who we are?
They see who you are.
They see who we are. Okay, so you know who we are. We don't know who you are. It would be nice if we did, but we generally start on these historical books with an overview, but I want to bring up just one specific point on 153. In 1497, at the top here, the pre-Reformation Catholic Tudor monarch Henry VII commissioned John Cabot, a Genoese Venetian mariner named Giovanni Caboto. I didn't realize that, but you know, both France, Spain, and Germany all had to commission an Italian mariner. You know, without us, we might have been found by yet. You know, they'd still be looking for us. So,
although, as he points out, the Vikings got here before John Cabot did.
Well, that's true.
They just didn't stay.
Yeah.
Well, nor did John Cabot. So nothing changed there.
So, okay, we've discussed Spain. We've discussed France. Now we come to England. A little late getting started on this because of what was going on in Europe, I suppose.
And what was going on in their own country.
Yes.
What was going on here?
Well, Joseph maybe would like to fill us in.
Well, mate, the 16th century in England was a time of a lot of upheaval, a lot of it being religious, you know, with the trying to enforcing Protestantism upon an England that didn't want it, with uprisings, the Northern Rebellion, the Pilgrimage of Grace. There were rebellions around the country under the reign of Edward VI, when they tried to, where they banned the Mass, introduced Protestant service. And then you had Mary Tudor coming on the throne and the whole reversal of things. And then Elizabeth I. And so, yeah, there's a lot of, the English were trying to sort themselves out at the time. It was a century of mess, and certainly not a century when England was looking outwards. It was very much looking at itself and trying to sort out what it was or what it wanted to be or what was being imposed upon it.
And then it had the Spanish Armada to deal with.
1588 Spanish Armada, yeah, and you know, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots the year before that. The Northern Rebellion, which was a consequence of that, and then the Armada, which was meant to be a retribution for the way that the Catholics were hanged without trial after the Northern Rebellion, and then the Armada failed, etc., etc., etc. I mean, yeah.
And you did not mention, Joseph, the glorious Revolution.
Well, that comes much later.
That's the following century, Father. That's 1688. We're in the 1580s here.
All right, but that was also, you know, had a great effect on what took place in America, actually,
oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, that a lot of, and what I found, I didn't know anything about at all. Actually, still on page 153, Father. This is all new to me. I knew about John Cabot, didn't know much about him, but further down here, a Catholic nobleman, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, in 1583 led an expedition of 260 recusants, so Catholic recusants, seeking to establish a colony somewhere in the vicinity of present-day New England. Nearly half a century before the Pilgrims and Puritans of New England, this small band of Catholics became the first Englishmen to see the New World as a haven for the practice of a dissenting faith. So it's interesting, the first Pilgrim Fathers in New England were actually Catholics escaping Protestant persecution.
Yes, and I wonder what would have happened had they succeeded. They
Yeah.
disappeared without a trace.
That's right, lost at sea.
Yeah.
When they were trying to get back after a failure of trying to establish a colony.
Yeah, and
then Sir Walter Raleigh. That too. This business about Gilbert was news to me too, because I had always thought it was Sir Walter Raleigh who had founded the first, tried to establish the first British colony.
Also, the wording up there is a bit unfortunate. We probably should have picked up the editing stage, and I'm as mea culpa as anything else for that. But obviously, it reads as if Sir Walter Raleigh was lost at sea with the rest of them, whereas of course he wasn't. Because he led this expedition in 1585 for this, and Gilbert's half brother Sir Walter Raleigh. Let's get this right now. Maybe I'm getting myself confused here. Tried to establish a colony area that is now Roanoke Island at the outer banks of North Carolina. This colony had no Catholic dimension. When supply ships finally arrived in 1590, they found no trace of the colonists, whom they presumed had been killed by natives. It's not clear that Sir Walter Raleigh wasn't one of those colonists that remained, although of course he wasn't. So you could read that and think that that was the end of Sir Walter Raleigh, which it wasn't. So the other thing I found very interesting, this is the one consequence of the Reformation was that the church lands, the monasteries, were put into the hands of a new class of aristocrats. And one thing they began to do from the late 1500s onwards was to enclose the common land. And on page 154 at the bottom and 155 here, we see how the enclosure movement, basically every village around England had a commons, which is basically a common property that allowed people that didn't have any land to graze their livestock. And this was a way that the peasants and the poor could supplement whatever other income they were getting. When the aristocracy that had taken the church land then enclosed the common land, it meant that the poor had no way of sustaining themselves because they had nowhere to graze their livestock. Therefore, they could not have livestock. And this created a whole class of beggars walking around the country here. So we have here, page 154, swarming at this day with valiant use, rusting and hurtful by lack of employment. And then at the bottom here, he says, the roving bands of wild youth reflected more directly the dislocation of existing populations through a process that historians have come to call the enclosure movement. And so we have this whole class of proletarianized people that have lost all property and all sustenance, and they have become a problem, a surplus population. And these are actually the people that are then encouraged to emigrate to the New World. So there's an indirect connection between the dissolution of the monasteries and the first English settlers in the New World.
And it's interesting to me that somewhat like during the 1850s in the Irish Pineda famine, that's what led a lot of Irish to come to America. But in this case, earlier on, you had the two classes coming. You had the poor, but you also had some of the nobles, the Catholic nobles, because apparently, in England at that time, if you were wealthy and aristocratic, you could live your Catholic life semi-privately and pay off some of the, fees and everything. And so the Catholic nobility was, a large number of them, and they came to the New World, Maryland, to try and escape some of the penal laws and the other difficulties that England imposed upon Catholics. But it was the wealthy Catholics who came in the poor Protestants. Yeah,
exactly, and poor peasants of whatever religion here, former peasants.
That's true, yeah.
The one slight disagreement I have with Christopher Shannon is that he seems to suggest that only the nobility continue to practice the Catholic faith. And certainly in the north of England, there were large swathes of the population in Lancashire and parts of Yorkshire where the working people, the ordinary working class, remained faithful and defiant Catholics through the whole period of the centuries. And that it was true that the the nobility might have supplied the priests by keeping them, but the ordinary people were also practicing Catholics. It wasn't just a recusant Catholic noble elite that continued to practice the faith. It was all classes.
Interesting to me also that, I mean, the Jesuits were very active in England, during the 1500s and 1600s, mainly by being martyred. But even though the presses had to be small, because to be in England as a Jesuit was basically having a death sentence hanging over your head. But they became very active in the British or English colonization of America.
Yeah, that was one thing I didn't know anything about, Father. When I read this chapter, I was very pleasantly surprised to see how involved the Jesuits were in Maryland and in other parts of the English part of North America at the time.
So we got the Calverts. I guess that's the first major family that had a Catholic serious influence in the New World. Most people probably won't recognize the name Calvert, but they will recognize the name Baltimore. And of course, Calvert became the Lord of Baltimore. But I was interested to find out that on page 159, about 5 lines down, King Charles raised Calvert to the peerage with the title Baron of Baltimore, parenthesis, a 4,000-acre estate in County Cork, Ireland. Didn't realize that Baltimore was actually an Irish name.
No, I didn't either. But of course, this is typical of the English involvement in Ireland, where they basically take the whole of the Irish land and then make it gifts to those who serve the crown. And that's one of the reasons why you have this an antagonism between the countries, because it was the aristocracy who betrayed the Irish people who got all the land. And in many cases, it's actually English aristocrats who were just given land in Ireland and estates and titles such as this. But he was a Catholic, which is unusual.
And also, what I found of interest, among other things, was that even though the penal laws in England were harsh, and they varied between being very harsh and less harsh, but always harsh, among the nobility at least, and probably among the peasants as well, there was a modus vivendi where they kind of got along and they made compromises and they worked with each other and so on. So it wasn't as if the society was so hermetically sealed off that had you were a Catholic, you had no commerce or intercourse with those who were not Catholic.
That was one of the very. Sorry, please, Vivian, please.
Well, I was just going to say one of the most interesting things about this chapter is how that very point that you make, Father, gets worked out back and forth through commerce and property rights. How commerce and property rights is what allowed Catholics to wiggle their way through life with all of this opposition and hostility. And, it's really that when it comes to practical matters, you can sometimes get along with people. The old saying, don't talk in public about politics, sex, or religion, right? And it's true that a lot of people, they don't really want to hate their neighbors if they can get along with them and get on with business and get on with life. And to see the Catholics navigate through this over centuries, back and forth between the New World here and England, was just such an eye popper.
Yeah, it's very important to me when I started doing my work on Tudor and Jacobean England, when I was doing my original work on Shakespeare, was I always thought the Catholics were sort of had to hide and keep themselves secret, and no one must know they're Catholics. And you kind of realize it's much more nuanced than that. That the Queen Elizabeth had Catholics in her court who she knew were Catholics. And, as long as they weren't perceived as a threat, she would turn a willful blind eye, and they just knew they couldn't flaunt it. And somehow, I think Father used the term modus vivendi. That's exactly what it was. And Christopher Shannon's a good historian, because he actually works with these nuances. So we're not seeing things in oversimplistic black and white, but in the full multifarious dimension of things.
Well, yes, and Vivian, I want to put a little codicil on what you talked about property rights being important and how commerce was a unifying factor. Where on page 184, this is one of the carols, middle of the page, where Charles Carroll, he didn't want to allow his property because he was the richest man in Maryland, partly by marrying two wealthy people, two wealthy widows, or a wealthy widow and then a wealthy young girl. But he secretly delayed his marriage to Elizabeth Brooks until 1757, despite her having given birth to their son Charles, later of Carrollton, 20 years earlier, because he didn't want to take the chance if he died young, she might marry a Protestant and all his property would go to the Protestants.
And he also wanted to tease out whether his son would remain Catholic, because he didn't want his son to be an heir if he were, after all this. But there is an irony here, that in order to stay true to the faith, you live with the mother of your son as if she were nothing but a concubine.
I know.
This is an irony, okay?
Yeah. Well, that's the other one. I mean, towards the end of the chapter, I mean, the ironies here. I mean, obviously, the carols are very important to American history. They're very important to Catholics, to Catholic history in North America. But they were slaveholders. The Jesuits owned plantations. And I do think again that it's good that Christopher Shannon's talking about this. We don't have to fall into the madness of woke, but we don't want to go to the other extreme and start brushing, the cockroaches under the carpet. We have nothing to fear from the truth. As simple as that. So let's talk about it, and let's talk about the situation of time, why it was, etc. But let's get everything out into the open.
I agree, and on that issue, first of all, when the French came, the Jesuits got a wealthy widow to buy a share in this company of 100 that was able to therefore come in and own land and everything. And here, when England was giving land to those who brought servants in who could take care of the land, page 164 in the middle, White, Altem, and Gervais, 3 Jesuits, arrived in Maryland as officially just another group of gentlemen adventurers. They were responsible for almost 1/3 of the servants on board of the Ark and the Dove, and claimed the land due to them for helping to populate the new colony. We Jesuits in our history are known for, a solid spiritual and intellectual formation, also being fairly shrewd in ways of the world. But here we have France. They get part ownership in the commercial company, and here in New England or the English colonies, they get land because they brought a bunch of servants. And then on the slavery issue, I definitely don't want to be an apologist for slavery, not at all. But, I think our view of slavery in America is often, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a wonderful work, obviously. But there were times in history when slavery was taken as the normal thing. You think the Greeks would have these slaves, like in Lewis's book, Till We Have Faces. You've got the Greek there, he's a slave. But he's the one that teaches the kids and so on. And I don't know this, but I suspect that the Jesuits with their slaves, which was not a good thing, nevertheless did not treat them like some of the slaveholders that you read about in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I'm not sure of that.
Well, I would certainly hope and presume that's the case. And slavery is part of the city of man. All sorts of junk is part of the city of man, and all of us live in the city of man, and so we get dirty sometimes. But that's an oversimplification. Vivian, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say that the difference between the transatlantic slave trade of blacks and the slavery of antiquity is there's a big difference, and that is that the black man was traded as chattel under the assumption that he wasn't fully human, and he became a commodity just because he was black. And in the ancient world, a lot of slavery was just the result of warfare. You know, you fought it out, you won. You could either slaughter everybody or you could take captives and sell them in slave markets and so on. There was a little bit different. Hence, you could have a Greek slave who became the teacher of your children. Aristotle was a slave who became the tutor of Philip of Macedon. So it took a while for people of Christian conscience to come to the realization that the black man, even though he was living in a more primitive way of life in Africa, was not an animal, that he was a man, he was a human being, he had a soul. And to the credit of the Catholic slaveholders, they did make sure that they got educated and baptized. So that's already a step up from treating them as mere animals.
Well, it's treating them as the dignity of the human person. It's treating them as equals in terms of the eyes of God.
Yes.
Right?
However, as long as you can own that man as property you can dispose of as you wish, his dignity is being violated just by that arrangement. And so, you know, yeah.
And I would say that, and again, there is no but to that. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try to avoid to use the word but it's difficult not to. The Soviet Union with the genocide in the Ukraine, with the Gulag Archipelago, with the slaughter of tens of millions of people by the Chinese communists, you know, the Nazi regime, you know, there's been abomination after abomination in the city of man, of which slavery is one of the worst examples.
That's right. That's right. So we just lump it in together with all the man's inhumanity to man.
Yes.
Is a constant in the city of man, right? And we, right, Christian conscience, need to point it out wherever it might be found. You know?
Yeah, like in a woman's womb. That's not a commodity either.
That is right.
Cells. Yeah, I agree.
Man's inhumanity to man needs to be called out wherever it's found. And to the credit of this great nation, we did eradicate slavery here.
Yes.
We did.
Now, can I say one thing just to check? It was following off of something Father said a long while ago, and then we got sidetracked on that very important issue we've just been discussing. But bottom of page 170, again, Jesuits. They're much better light now. Ingle rounded up the Jesuits and sailed for England to present them before Parliament as evidence of Calvert's papist regime. He put three of them, John Cooper, Bernard Hartwell, and Roger Rigby, ashore in an area controlled by the Susquehanna, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, leaving them to die either at the hands of the Indians or by exposure to the elements. None were ever heard from again, and all may be counted the first martyrs of British North America. Not to be overlooked.
I'm glad you brought that up. That was indeed a very important point. The other interesting thing I found in this chapter was, okay, so you mentioned the Carrolls becoming the most prominent, important Catholic family in the colonies. And one of them signed the Declaration of Independence. Another Carroll signed the Constitution. And another Carroll became the first bishop of a colony in North America. So they were just such a huge part of this.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is how the author explains the impact that this background had on the way the church itself took shape.
Yes.
That this sort of republicanism of politics sort of made its way into how families like the Carrolls wanted the church itself to be governed, and that there was a certain amount of back and forth between church leaders, many of whom were lay leaders here, and Rome. And this took a while to work out, right? Where Rome had to sort of reassert her primacy in picking bishops and in the laws of the church and so on. I didn't know a lot about that history.
Yeah, that was also very, very good. The other thing, obviously I'm much more ignorant of this than both of you, American history in general. But at the time of we discussed last week when we talked about France about the impact of the Quebec Act in raising anti-Catholic, anti-British sentiment amongst the revolution, who would become the revolutionaries. But in the middle of page 188 here, I didn't know this, but on the eve of independence, the Catholic Church was legal in only one colony, tolerant, non-conforming Quaker, Pennsylvania. So it's very much an anti-Catholic republic that was established in 1776.
And Maryland itself, which started out being a refuge for Catholics, because of the politics going on in England, it kept going back and forth and back and forth. And so here it is, the Quakers. Yeah. At this point in time, only the Quakers will really welcome Catholics. Yeah.
It was interesting, actually, how Maryland was actually invaded by Virginia. That was one of the reasons that the Catholics were defeated in Maryland, is because the Virginia basically invaded them at the behest of England.
Yep. That was news to me, too.
The other thing I found very interesting here, because this is November the 9th. November the 5th, of course, is Guy Fawkes Night in England, where the English celebrate the discovery and putting down of the gunpowder plot by burning an effigy of Guy Fawkes, one of the papist conspirators. And I grew up with that tradition, and it's actually our 4th of July. It's also known as Fireworks Night. And fireworks are set off. It's a much better time of the year to have fireworks on the 4th of July because it's actually dark. But the other thing, in certain towns like Lewis and Sussex, they don't just burn Guy Fawkes, they burn the Pope. And not just an abstract Pope, but the current Pope, to make it really personal. So, but here I found very interesting. I didn't know this, page 193. Mm-hmm. George Washington banned the celebration of Guy Fawkes' Day among the soldiers of his army, judging the, quote, ridiculous and childish custom of burning the effigy of the Pope to be so monstrous as not to be suffered or excused. Well, that's one reason for liking George Washington, that's for sure.
George Washington had an interesting relationship with Catholicism. When he was a boy, he somehow got instructed by a Jesuit manual for young men on classical learning and right behavior, and Washington memorized it. And then, of course, he's the man who put up the money for the first Catholic church in Virginia. Here we see him banning Guy Fawkes Day. When the Continental Army began working side by side with the French to win, let's face it, the colonies would not have won the War of Independence without the help of France. And Washington became personal friends with members of the French officer class who were Catholics. So, he's an interesting character in this story.
And there is an opinion or a view of some with some evidence that he actually, on his deathbed, he became a Catholic. Now, we'll see. We don't know, but
I never heard that. But
I had, back on what you said, Vivian, about the structure of the church was influenced by what happened here in a rather independent society away from the mainland of Europe and so on. And part of that was, of course, that when being a Catholic was still illegal in some way, it was the nobility who had chapels in their homes. And so where was the church? Well, the church was at this wealthy person's home. And therefore, you exercise some control. It's your house. You can let people in who you want and not let in who you don't want. So you kind of chose the priest on your own. A couple of minor points like this on the 168, when the Jesuits are trying to describe some of the native beliefs, they talk about this ceremony where they're smoking the pipes and everything, and they cried out, Yahoo! Yahoo! And I thought, okay. That's an order. And then on page 187 at the top, well, on 186, there's a long sort of critical of Catholic quotation, and it's by John Adams. And I mean, I have a great respect for John Adams. And actually, he wasn't so anti-Catholic in his public policy. both, as he was involved in the Constitution and also as president. But interesting to me that someone who was so well educated and so refined in a certain sense as John Adams should write such harsh things about the Catholic Church.
Well, the author does point out that it was serving a political end, right?
Okay.
Linking taxes to Catholic priestcraft was a way to discredit Parliament on 187. Okay. So I agree. I was disappointed to see Adams stooping that low.
Exactly. In fact, it's almost worse if he is using it purely for rhetorical reasons. It's like, someone pandering to the racism of the mob, even if they're not a racist themselves, right? It's not really a defense, is it?
Right.
So, we're kind of skipping around, but it's okay. When I was in Baltimore, been there once or twice, I did go to the cathedral. It's a very beautiful cathedral, still there. It was designed by Latrobe, Benjamin Latrobe, who was not a Catholic, but he was sensitive to Catholic, artistic and architectural tradition. And he actually wanted to make it Gothic, which probably would have been better, my view, but he ended up doing it in the same style, the classical style of what he did in Washington, D.C. But on the middle of page 201...
Because Carroll himself wanted that.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And Carroll wanted it. So the result is the Baltimore Cathedral, like the American Catholic Church Carroll was then building, would have a Republican exterior and an Orthodox inner life. That was a beautiful reflection on that.
Right. That some of the appearances of compromise, that of course had to be made to just get by in a hostile world. There was an inner orthodoxy, if you will, and an inner resolve that often was hidden from view. But the way Shannon writes this, it's as if that was able to emerge more and more as Catholics got a firmer footing,
Yeah, I mean, you see this sort of in various ways. So, for instance, during the Catholic revival in the 19th century in England, following the conversion of Newman and others, the old Catholic recusant families were almost embarrassed by how zealous the converts were in going out in public and proselytizing, because they for 300 years they've been sort of conditioned to keep your piety to yourself. You can be very pious, but it's at home, right? You don't go out in the public square and proclaim it. So this has sort of almost been programmed out of their collective psyche. And so there was this conflict between the private stay-at-home Catholicism of the recusants and the let's go and convert the world zeal of the converts. And the other thing I found interesting actually is another parallel, page 199, between the experience of England and the United States at around the same time, the unexpected counter-revolutionary conservative consequences of the French Revolution. So about 8 lines down to page 199, the vicious anti-clericalism and persecution of the church under the French Revolution caused Carroll and other American clerics to temper their enthusiasm for the new politics. So too, many of those clerics were in fact French priests living in exile from revolutionary France and not inclined to entertain fine distinctions between good and bad republicanism. So same thing happened in England. Where all of a sudden the English became sympathetic to the French Catholics who had been persecuted by basically communists, and let all of these French emigre priests in the country, who then started practicing the faith, and it led to the genesis of the Catholic revival. So we're tempted to think sometimes when we see a debacle like the French Revolution, oh my world, the world's come to an end, right? It's the rise of Antichrist. And yet in the way that providence works out, there are consequences to that anti-Christian thing, which actually leads to a growth of Christianity directly and indirectly.
Well, it happened in Jerusalem in the early church when there's a persecution by the Jews of the Christians. They dispersed. And that was one of the forces which led them all over Asia and then even into Europe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the persecution of Catholics in Ireland, leading to the Irish diaspora, you know, and the spread of Catholicism in North America, Australia, England. You know, the working class Catholics in England are mostly of Irish descent.
Well, sometimes you can't fully see what a thing is until it manifests in its extreme form, right?
Yeah, and the problem is, Vivian, that we live, well, not a problem, it's a blessing, but we only live for 70 years and 10 or thereabouts. So we don't see the playing out of history, right, in our own lifetimes. And we're always tempted to think whatever the status quo is somehow permanent. Well, it's not, it's transient. And that's why the study of history, which we're doing now, allows us to see things in context. Otherwise, we believe that the now in which we're living is somehow sort of some permanent, you know, stasis, which it is not.
So we're running out of time. We have to see something about trusteeism and then briefly the saints that he mentions here. Trusteeism was very important because, again, this kind of grew out, it seems to me, of the fact that it was the wealthy who had the chapels, and then they had the people who actually build their own churches. But part of that, there's a part in here about the Germans wanted to make sure they ran their church because they wanted to protect themselves and have their traditions against the incursions of the Irish, especially. And when I think about immigration in the 19th century to the United States, mainly from Catholic countries, I think of Ireland and Italy. When I was a kid, there was a big Irish Catholic or Italian Catholic. But by far, the largest immigrant group in this country up until the late 20th century has been the Germans. More German immigrants than either Irish or Italian. And you can see that, you know, their influence is everywhere. But that was one of the reasons they wanted to have some control of the church, because it was the Irish clerics coming over, and the Germans wanted to have a German priest. By the way, we mentioned, Joseph, you mentioned a thing about the French clerics coming, or maybe you did, Vivian. There were a lot of French priests who became bishops here in this country. A lot of early bishops were French, as well as French laity that came. But the French had a very important influence in the development of the Catholic Church, you know, after the Revolution, because a lot of those priests who had to leave France came here. Anything more on trusteeism?
Nope.
Anything on the saints? We have the Toussaint.
Well, he ends, you know, with Elizabeth Ann Seton, and her story is amazing. And for her to be our first homegrown saint, you know, she's a great woman. And if it hadn't been for her, the Catholic school system in this country would have not gotten the start that it did.
Yeah, and I think it's an appropriate way and a very good way of ending the section on England, to end with the story of a saint in the English-speaking part of the United States. So it's an uplifting way of ending this section.
Well, I'm sorry you said that, because I want to make my last word a little different. You know, there's a wonderful book called Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville, who was only in his early 30s when he came here in early 18th century, or 19th century, 1800s. And he was actually sent from France to visit the prison system here. I'm not sure why. But he ended up writing this book on democracy in America, which is still a classical text. Mm-hmm. But in the appendix, he has something about Cotton. I used to call him Cotton Mather. I guess you say Mather, one of the great, Protestant divines of the early colonies. And Tocqueville says, the most esteemed and most important document that we possess on the history of New England is the work of Reverend Cotton Mather, entitled Magnalia Christi Americana, or the Ecclesiastical History of New England, 1620 to 1696. So what does Mather say in his book? De Tocqueville goes on. Mather's book makes known admirably the time and the country that he seeks to describe. Should he want to inform us about the grounds that brought the Puritans to seek asylum beyond the seas, he says, so he's going to set down the motives for this whole movement of the Pilgrims to the United States. I'm quoting Mather now. The God of heaven served, as it were, a summons upon, this is italicized, upon the spirits of his people in the English nation, stirring up the spirits of thousands which never saw the faces of each other, with the most unanimous inclination to leave all the pleasant accommodations of their native country and go over a terrible ocean into a more terrible desert for the pure enjoyment of all his ordinances. It is now reasonable, before we pass any further, the reasons of this undertaking to be more exactly made known unto posterity, especially unto the posterity of those that were the undertakers, lest they come at length to forget and neglect the true interest of New England. Wherefore, I shall now just transcribe some of them from a manuscript wherein they were then tendered under consideration. I'm only going to give his first reason. First, here's the reasons why they came. It will be a service unto the church of great consequence to carry the gospel into those parts of the world, North America, and raise a bulwark against the kingdom of Antichrist, which the Jesuits labor to rear up in all parts of the world. So that's why they came, to raise a bulwark against the Jesuits. Well, it was an idea that whose time perhaps has come. Anything else?
That seems an appropriate place to end, Father.
All right. Well, we'll see you all next week. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.